Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. For this week's episode, you have myself, Rachel Sherlock, and joining me once again is Robyn Conroy. Welcome back to the show.
Hello everybody, I'm very happy to be back.
Lovely to have you here. And I tend to bring Robyn on for a lot of my film episodes, or maybe less the literary ones. I know you do a lot of reading, but you're kind of my go-to for film. On this occasion, I think it's maybe the first one that we're talking about that isn't about animation, given that you're an animator. So
animator by trade, but film aficionado by choice.
I think, yep, that sounds about right.
There's a lot of film studies in that course as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so it always feels really fitting to bring you on for these kinds of episodes. It's nice having done some more kind of intense literary episodes. I think it's good to have a slightly more lighthearted one. And so we want to talk about one of our favourite TV shows, which is Stranger Things. I love Stranger Things. And I always think of it around this time of year. To me, especially the first season feels quite autumnal or wintry, just those long dark evenings coming in, even though we're recording this on what must be the summeriest day of autumn.
I know, it is such a warm September. I'm in short sleeves.
Yeah, Phoebe was looking at the window before she left today and she was like, Rachel, do I need sunscreen? So it may be a little bit summery, but we're kind of coming into the autumn mentality, and I think it's a perfect time to bring up something like Stranger Things, which is one of those kind of, in many ways, and we're going to be talking about that, iconic. It plays a lot on those tropes and those expectations of Halloween-y or autumnal kind of scary atmospheric kind of settings. And so I think maybe I should just begin with a little bit of... I know a lot of people have seen Stranger Things, but there will also be others who haven't. And so just to give a kind of grounding in what we're talking about, I'm going to do a basic setup for the plot. As me and Robyn were talking about this before we were recording... I'd say expect spoilers. I don't think that I'm going to go out of my way to give spoilers, but it's definitely, if you really don't want to know what happens in the story, we're just going to be talking about it as if you know what's happening in the story. Yeah. So just a heads up on that.
I think specifically in terms of if you care about thematic spoilers, because I think that's going to be a lot of what we're kind of drawing from. So
yeah, I think that's spot on. So Stranger Things is one of those big blockbuster Netflix series. It centers mainly on a group of friends, 4 friends, Mike, Will, Dustin and Lucas, who it opens with them playing D&D. It's this classic 80s, I think it begins in 1983, classic 80s setting. From the off, you get a lot of instant recognition with things like Stephen King and E.T. The whole vibe is very much well set even within the first minute of the series, and the plot kind of centers around the 4 boys are playing D&D, and as they're cycling home, Will is cycling home and goes missing, and that's the sort of trigger point for the plot. And what the first season at least kind of centers around is looking for Will, and he's gone missing. And so the remaining 3 friends go to look for him, and while they're looking for him, they encounter a girl. They don't find Will, but they find a girl who's sort of wandering around the woods, fairly shell-shocked, can't really speak. They're the same age, but she's clearly not normal. And what is kind of revealed relatively early on is that she's a sort of medical experiment that can use telekinesis and a certain form of telepathy, and is altered in a sort of supernatural way. So she becomes a huge part of the story, but the hunt for Will is still on, and you have kind of the three different generations all interacting with this story. So you have the kids, like I said, who are conducting their own research. They're trying to find Will. They're trying to get things going themselves. You have the adults, most of whom are fairly ineffectual, but you have a couple of very important adults, mainly Will's mother, Joyce, and the chief of police, Hopper, who the two of them are kind of the main adult driving forces in trying to find out what's happening. And then at the same time, you also have the teenage older siblings. You have Will's older brother, Jonathan, who's obviously looking for Will. You also have Mike's older sister, Nancy, who is looking for her friend, Barb, who actually goes missing as well, and her boyfriend, Steve. And so you have these kind of three strata of different ages all engaging in this mystery. And I think, for me at least, it that kind of intergenerational, sometimes they're on their own, sometimes they're interacting with each other, but like seeing the three different ages all on this kind of adventure in some ways together is really appealing about it.
Absolutely. Like, I feel like that's one of the things that is such a big draw, is that you're really seeing, I guess, each of these generations in the context of the 80s in which they're placed, but also just like in the context of family and friendship and conflict, and how their age kind of informs the way that they interact with this kind of otherworldliness and strangeness that they're coming across.
Absolutely. And then what the series kind of centers on going forward is the fact that they uncover that there is a government experiment, which is tied to what's going on with the young girl who's called 11, and she's a part of that, but she's not the only part of that, which is that they've also sort of torn a rip in the fabric of reality, which has both allowed access to a sort of disgusting, murky shadow world version of our world, which is called the Upside Down, but almost probably more importantly, it also lets out sort of demonic forces that are living within this Upside Down, who then attack various people within the community and drag them to the Upside Down. And so the main kind of conflict of the story is in both kind of grappling with this supernatural reality and also, you know, trying to look, at least in the first season, look for Will and reestablish the kind of equilibrium that they had before.
I think quite notably, Hopper mentions that the worst thing that's happened in the town before Will has gone missing is that an owl flew into a woman's head because it thought it was a nest.
Amazing. And I think that's important as well. This isn't actually, because I think a lot of 80s referential pop culture stuff is centered on like almost city living or maybe suburban living. And this is very suburban, but it's almost suburban/rural. This is a very small town. It's called Hawkins, Indiana. And it's small town. And I think there's a lot of appeal in that kind of close community, the freedom of kids to go off and have these adventures, the kind of latchkey setup that's within these communities. Like you said, it's so unexpected to have something crazy happening because this is somewhere where nothing ever happens, and you know, those kind of great coming of age tropes in that way. And yeah, I think it's a great story. I think we reference it a little bit, but it really centers on the characters and the fact that, especially for Christians and Catholics watching it, to me at least, is really centered around virtue and people being virtuous, and friendship and sacrifice and loyalty and doing the right thing.
And how sin kind of is so difficult to get around, and the value of truth and honesty is really like central to it. And yeah, owning up to sin as well, I think, is a big theme that comes back, of like people actually living up to their actions and kind of moving forward and repenting for things that they have failed in, you know? Yeah,
and I think it also flags a lot of the dangers of both that society and going on into our modern society, for everything from government dismissal of the value of human life and the sort of reckless destruction of the natural goods in the world, all the way to the sort of consumerism and lack of community within families. I think there's a trend of like absent fathers and broken families. Not in a, I think there's a lot of very modern TV and storytelling that centers around broken families in a really kind of crushingly depressing way. I don't think it's that, but I think it's just sort of woven in it's there in the background to see that this is the backdrop of what's happening. I know one of the articles we were reading on this was pointing out it happens in sort of the divorce boom of the 80s as well, and that sense of the breakdown of family communities.
And there's a real kind of absence of father figures, or like a failure of the father figures who are present, who may as well be absent in many places. Notably, is it Mike's father, who kind of like Ted, perpetually seems to be in a lounge chair, kind of dozing in front of the TV, and that's kind of like his sole role in the plot.
I think it's that kind of interesting. So and like I think Mike's sister Nancy in particular is really aware of this as like a sort of dead end way of living, and she kind of reacts in the sort of teenager like typical rebellion kind of way. But I think she is recognizing the soullessness of this economic dream of the 80s at the time.
Yeah, there's a real sense that their family have a kind of veneer of perfectness, and they're monetarily comfortable, but there's a kind of an emptiness at the center of kind of that relationship. Whereas when you look at the Byers family, which are much more rough and ready,
and more openly dysfunctional, like his father has openly left and has a girlfriend and isn't interested. Like I think that's broken in a really visual way that's obvious for the community to see. And yet there's a lot more love and a lot more compassion and like fight for your family.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Which I think is very, very central to the show as well, is the kind of sense of like a dark underbelly, or like an alternate side to everything that you're seeing, in a way that like the Upside Down is sort of like a very blatant visual representation of the sense that there is one vision that's very beautiful and another like version of what's happening that's quite dark,
and rotting, like that idea of like hidden rot, which I think especially in season 2 is like a really used visual of like it causes crops to rot. But I think for the episode we're not just going to talk about why we like Stranger Things.
We could do that all day.
We could do that all day, but in every episode of Risking Enchantment I do try to take an angle for something that helps us to assess our faith and also how our faith interacts with the world. And I think what we came up with for Stranger Things was less to do with the show itself, although we're definitely going to weave in the themes of the show into this, and more to do with the fact that it is part, as much as we like it is part of a real, almost relentless craze for nostalgia at the moment. And I'll throw my hands up and say I'm definitely part of that. Like I'm really partial to a lot of 80s pop culture. Not all of it, I'm going to say, and some of it would be very relevant for here. I don't know a lot of Stephen King, which is a really obvious reference point for Stranger Things, or even some of the Spielberg stuff that it references. Like I don't know everything, but I do love that kind of the era. I feel like, to me at least, it has a real sense of optimism and earnestness in the pop music and in like the teenage coming of age films. Like I really enjoy that, and there's lots of things that I definitely feel nostalgic about or buy into that kind of nostalgia market. I know a lot of people would call me a massive hipster. It's really hard to deny that accusation when I've got like a vinyl record player sitting right beside me. But that, as much as I love that about Stranger Things, and I think we're going to, again, later come back and say it's not just sort of vacuous nostalgia, that it is doing something a little bit more meaningful or a little bit more creative than that, but that we have to reckon with the fact that nostalgia is this sort of all-encompassing craze at the moment, and what that means for Christians especially, who have to remember that they were made for such a time as this, and what does it mean to be overly nostalgic.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I'll kind of jump in here and say that, like, so there's a kind of an idea in film kind of theory, or like, I guess, mass media kind of a theory around that there's sort of a 30-year cycle that works with how we become nostalgic for things, in that there's sort of a sense that we are nostalgic for the things that we experienced in childhood, or the era that we kind of just missed, because obviously we see with kind of like the kids in Stranger Things that they are immersed in the culture that they're in, but they're also kind of looking up to the things that they're not able to do, or the freedoms they don't have, that they kind of see their kind of teenage counterparts able to partake in. And that's kind of like a constant tension of them wanting to push further and trying to do more things, and kind of being, well, very unsuccessfully reined in most of the time. But so there is this kind of sense that with that kind of pop culture resurgences, we see it's generally the people who grew up as kids in an era, kind of looking back on what they saw as like their halcyon days of like what was truly beautiful. And so that's kind of why we see now with like the kind of Zoomer 90s culture revival, it like that's the generation kind of just behind us, and they're glorifying the 90s as an era that they kind of only just like saw in their babyhood, you know. And in that kind of vein, it's no surprise to me that like people like Spielberg or George Lucas, who wrote and directed the Star Wars films, that both of them have a real love of 1950s Norman Rockwell paintings, which would have been just the era before when they were kids. And there's a sense of this sort of cyclical nature that, like, so those are the 80s films that inspire Stranger Things. But I think, like Spielberg said himself, that, like, in terms of Rockwell's illustrations, which are, you know, the epitome of American 1950s culture, like he said about them, they pushed a benign but important agenda of a kind of community, of a kind of civic responsibility, to patriotic duties, to understanding our nation by understanding our neighbor. And he did this in one frame, in one image. And it's interesting because Spielberg himself actually came from quite a poor background, and so like he said of himself that like he was living on a street where his family were the only people who didn't have Christmas lights up at Christmas, like they only had the porch light on. And so there's a sense in which when he's looking at Rockwell's images of the 1950s that he grew up in, he's kind of seeing a kind of beautiful, idealized, fantasized version of his own childhood. And then with the Duffer Brothers, Stranger Things, we're kind of seeing them in turn kind of looking at what was kind of shiny and beautiful in many ways about the 1980s that may not be fully encapsulating what the reality was. Though I will say that though it is an optimistic vision, we certainly do see, it's not a completely perfected vision, but we definitely see, say in season 3, like a version of the American mall of the 1980s as something sort of very idyllic and almost like temple-like in the way that it's sort of depicted. A lot of 1980s American culture really sort of glorified.
Yeah, I do think I think you have some points about the sort of commercialization of especially that season 3, which is centered on the mall. But I do think that like they take it to a point that is like satire in that it's so clearly like the dream,
girls flipping their hair, you know?
the sort of commercial dream that's been sold to people at that time of the mall as this like great human achievement, and you know, we kind of know that it's going to collapse within 20-30 years, that, you know, now malls are almost a thing of the past, which is something I think we'll come back to. But I think it's really interesting what you're talking about, and when preparing for this episode, I was returning to a book which I referenced quite a bit in a episode about a year ago where I was talking with the author Fiorella de Maria. The book is called The Past is a Foreign Country, and it's just a really interesting, like, it's actually an academic text, but it takes a look at the ways that we approach the past. And actually, I think it might be in one of the sections that has been added since it was first released. I think it was first released actually in the 80s and then was re-released, I've just checked now, is in 2015 with like a whole section updated. But that this kind of leaning on nostalgia as a sort of growing phenomenon, and that actually the 80s, I'd be interested to read more about it, because it says, it has a quote which says the 80s is sort of a founding decade for this. But there is always something like the Gothic revival of the Victorian era is decidedly nostalgic, or the kind of classical focus during the Renaissance of like going back to the classic era, things like that. But in some ways, I guess, like you're saying, this like 30-year cycle, it's like getting more and more microcosmic. Instead of being in the 1880s and 1890s looking back to the Gothic medieval era, it's suddenly becoming smaller and smaller intervals of what you're looking back on, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess that's kind of a sense in which like there's this almost like decadent setting in of kind of a desperate need to rehash and reiterate and relive the beautiful moments, but the beautiful moments are getting closer and closer together.
Yeah. To the point where it's now like people who were living through it are still young enough to be like not rosy-eyed about it and being like, no, it wasn't like that at all. And so I have a quote or two from The Past is a Foreign Country, which says, "Nostalgia is today's favourite mode of looking back. It saturates the press, serves as advertising bait, merits sociological study, and expresses modern malaise." And I think that's a really good point to remind ourselves that nostalgia is not the only way of interacting with the past. I think people just assume that that's how we interact with the past, but it isn't actually. And weirdly, like you think of, I think it was in the 60s and 70s more, that there was a sort of impatience with nostalgia, that like you should be looking to the future and like happy about, you know, you should be embracing the future as opposed to obsessed with the past. And I think, especially as Catholics, I think we would be a little bit more wary of that approach, or I
think there's sort of like, there's a middle ground in that, like I feel like often the eras that are more kind of prone to be glorified are the kind of more, I guess, sedentary or like less, you know, so like the 60s and 70s were very fraught, and then we see eras like the 1950s and the 1980s where from a personal kind of household point of view, it's actually an area, like a period of like more relative peace and simplicity. And I guess there is also a danger in like nostalgizing to the point where you see a bygone era as a sort of a utopia or a perfected time, and kind of miss the flaws that are present in every age. But then also, yes, there is the flip side, which is kind of a fixatedness on the future that kind of like misses what's happening now as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, as is almost always the case, you know, it is about finding some kind of path where there's a balance between the two, and that, you know, nostalgia has a place, but it can't be the only way that we interact with the past, and that you can love and cherish and be interested in the things of any era of the past without falling into nostalgia, that you can balance it out with a healthy dose of realism, with a healthy dose of like scholarly appreciation, or seeing yourself as still part of that continuity, rather than it being like a glass box thing that you can't actually access anymore, you know? Yeah. And I think it's really interesting, one of the quotes from this book, it's so depressing to think that this was, and it's always the case of like, oh, when I was young, people were more polite, says Plato, you know, and it's like one of those things of like, oh, it was ever thus. But it is kind of amazing to see someone at the new millennium's eve, a critic moaned that America has no now. Our culture is composed of sequels, reruns, remakes, revivals, reissues, recreations, reenchantments, adaptations, anniversaries, memorabilia, oldies radio, and nostalgia record collections. This is echoed in the 1980s, the founding decade of replay, recycle, recall, retrieve, reprocess, rerun from more creative times. But I think what's interesting is the way that even within the 20 years since that was said, that we now have more and more ways of accessing that with the digital world and the onset of social media. Again, a bit later, this book says, once the solace or menace of the few, nostalgia now attracts and afflicts all. And I think that's a really interesting point, that it used to be not something so universal. I think we all have kind of accepted nostalgia as a very normal thing in society, and that's not actually true. But yeah, so that it attracts and afflicts all. Myriad ancestor hunters scour archives, millions throng to historic houses, antiques engross the hoi polloi, every childhood past is souvenired. Reversing earlier ill repute, nostalgia is promoted as therapeutic, an aid to self-esteem, a crutch for personal continuity, a defense against reminders of mortality. It's interesting, and I think when we think of like even things like 23andMe and those like plugging in to see your ancestors and like finding out more about your family history, and again, each of these things can be good in and of themselves. It's never the case that you just point to one thing and say we should stop doing this, but that there is an aggressive kind of obsession with how the past was better now, I think. And I think it sort of speaks to our discomfort with the present. But that doesn't necessarily mean that nostalgia is the remedy to that.
I think also just on like a technical point of view as well, like there was more homogeneity of forms in which media could come to us in the 80s as well, you know. Yeah. Like there is a kind of a splintering that we're seeing in this era in terms of cultural differences of where people place themselves in camps, and in a way, one way that we can kind of all unite is actually in looking back to like previous media where there was a more kind of like unanimous interaction with the few TV shows that were present, as opposed to the vast number of streaming sites that we now have access to, you know?
Yeah. And I think something like Stranger Things is one of the few examples of a large quantity of viewers all consuming the same thing.
Yeah.
I will say that pretty much my main reason for getting Netflix was to watch Stranger Things.
Yeah, well, it's that's their plan, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And that I think that's really true in that sense of like cultural unity, and the only way to access that is then by going into a time when you could have referential things. Like you said, that there's a smaller amount of content. I think I was really struck recently by the fact that there's a real glut of pop music at the moment, which is really explicit about longing for the 90s. And I know we've said this, but I just think it's so funny that we have like there was one by an artist called Charlie XCX called 1999, and I think the chorus to that is like, I just want to go back to 1999. Or there's another one by a singer, Anne Marie, called 2002, and the chorus of that is just a mashup of like lines from the greatest hits of like the late 90s.
Well, yeah.
And this goes into something that we're going to touch on a little bit later, of like the digital age and how difficult it is to navigate the digital age and why it makes nostalgia make sense. But there's one by Phineas, who's the older brother of Billie Eilish. I know for a fact there will be people listening to this podcast who won't know any of the names that I've just said now, and I'm sorry, but they are the big names of pop music at the moment. You know, this is a song I really like, but he has a song called The 90s, and it begins with, sometimes I think about the 90s. I know everyone romanticized it, but you could sign me up for a world without the internet. Whereas those other examples were just like blatant nostalgia and like just sort of kind of in a fun way, but like clearly just self-indulgent nostalgia. Certainly the last example with Phineas is a lot more about that feeling of stagnation and not reaching your potential and trying to look back on a time when you felt like the world was kind of open to you.
And I think that's really present in Stranger Things as well, in that kids are they're interacting with each other with a huge amount of kind of joy and enthusiasm. One of the first shots that we see in the first episode is just like a bunch of boys around a D&D table, just like so much enjoying the experience, this tactile experience of interacting with this board and each other. Their communication and their relationships with each other are really tender, and there's something very, I don't know, tangible, and the running around on their bikes across the town and stuff like that. There's something very tactile about their interactions with the world that are really joyful to just view and experience.
I think so, and I think that's something we want to maybe dive into a little bit further. But I just think to kind of close out on the nostalgia, I just think we should maybe pull that into a slightly more specifically Catholic perspective. And it's not just to note that this thing is happening, but also to see how it feeds into our faith. And I think it's really important, because as someone who does, I'm a medievalist. I love history. I love old buildings. I get frustrated with the way that we construct our streets, our buildings, our world. It's very easy to take that reflection of the past and then sort of transpose onto that a real feeling of perfection, of rose-tinted glasses, that everything was fine and nothing was wrong at those times. And I think that's a really alluring trap to fall into with our faith as well. I'm very aware of the kind of different struggles that are going on in the church about what does tradition look like, and what does carrying on the older rites or older expressions of the faith, and wanting to not just reenact them, but bring them back into life, and with them to, revive the faith as well. I think a lot of it comes from a desire to see a more lively faith. And it's not just about wanting to kind of enact the past or imagine yourself in the past, but that we still need to have that balance and those clear-sighted glasses, that there is no utopia. There was no time when something was perfect. And it was interesting that I saw a quote, I don't know whether it was recent or whether it just sort of resurfaced on Twitter this week, of Pope Francis saying something about nostalgia is kind of killing the church. And I know a lot of people took that really negatively, and I can understand why, but saying that making the case for tradition, or making the case for the Catholic continuity and heritage and the wealth of genius that went into the art and the expression of the faith in the past. But I think the thing to really focus in on is that word nostalgia, that and I certainly won't pretend to speak for the Pope or know exactly what his intention was with that. But I think for ourselves, it's important to keep that frame of mind, that nostalgia isn't the only way to interact with the past, and that there is almost an element of negativity. Nostalgia might be a bad thing, and if it is a good thing, it's still a qualified good thing, that we need to make sure that we're not being blinded by what we love about the past to fail to engage with what about the past brought us to here.
Yeah, I have a quote from Henry Nouwen. It's from the 80s. I'd love to do a count on how many times you say the words 80s and nostalgia at the end. I just thought it really, for me, kind of highlighted that fine line of, I guess, embracing tradition and embracing the beauty of the past in a way that informs our present and informs how we see the world now, as opposed to sitting in it and kind of marinating in something and not letting it inform our day-to-day lives. And so he's talking about the experience of having done a kind of a sabbatical in a monastery, and he's kind of just talking on his experience of having been there, and feeling like he hasn't had the full transformation that he had hoped that it would kind of be a before and after of his life, and yet it's still kind of, he has this fond memory of it as something very beautiful and pure in its experience. And so he says, "Why did I go at all? Because there was an inner must to which I received a positive response. Why did I stay? Because I knew I was at the right place and nobody told me otherwise. Why was I there? I don't fully know yet. Probably I will not know fully before the end of the cycle of my life. Still, I can say that I have a most precious memory which keeps unfolding itself in all that I do or plan to do. I no longer can live without being reminded of the glimpse of God's graciousness that I saw in my solitude, of the ray of light that broke through my darkness, of the gentle voice that spoke in my silence, and of the soft breeze that touched me in my stillest hour. This memory, however, does more than bring to mind rich experiences of the past. It also continues to offer new perspectives on present events and guides in decisions for the years to come. In the midst of my ongoing compulsions, illusions, and unrealities, this memory will always be there to dispel false dreams and point in right directions. When Peter, James, and John saw the Lord in his splendor on Mount Tabor, they were heavy with sleep. But the memory of this event proved a source of hope in the midst of their later hardships. And I think that's kind of like a way in which we can see a vision of looking at the goodness of past eras and kind of using it to inform how we live our lives now, but not letting it make us stagnate.
Yeah, I love that. I think it is really right and good for Catholics to love our heritage. Like, we have such an incredible heritage. Everything from the saints to the artists to the political workers or people working for social change. Like, we have a wonderful history, but we also have a dark history. There is the upside down, you know? Or even just, you know, to point out that the good times also had undercurrents that brought us to where we are now. And so if everything was perfect at one point in the church, you know, why did it change? And that change often comes from a lack of attention in a particular area, or a way that people were struggling or underfed or undernourished, or failing to encounter Christ in the way that they should. And so, you know, I just think that it is really good for us to want to see the church's history as a continuous thing, as something we're still present in, as something that doesn't just sort of shed its leaves as it goes along. But like you said, that it can't, I think we can feel trapped when the modern world fails to live up to our idealized version of the past, and also fail to see the ways that each age has its own unique calling. That line from Esther that I said already, that like, you were made for such a time as this. And so to want to live in the past is to reject what God offered you in bringing you in at this specific time.
Yes, exactly. I think that, and that everything has to be rooted in Christ, you know, nothing, no time, if it's not, you know, if we're not living it for Christ and living it through Christ, there's no time in which things will be good. And you know, that's the centrality that everything has to come through, and that is kind of present in all of our kind of temporal experience.
And, you know, I've met people who are just as sort of adamant about their attachment to their 1960s hymnal as I've met people who are attached to their Gregorian chant, you know, that like we have to assess ourselves from all sides of like, what are the terms on which we're willing to accept the church and Christ, that like it says, well, I will only have my mass if I'm allowed to sing He Will Lift Me Up on Eagle's Wings, you know. Like, it sounds ridiculous, and I'm not trying to be flippant about liturgy, because I know it is such an important part of our Catholic experience, but I just want to delineate between engaging with the past and continuing on traditions, and distinguishing that from nostalgia, and that those two things are separate, and we should treat them as separate things.
Yes, absolutely.
And yeah, but that like there is that sense of drawing on the good things from the past, and I think that'll maybe bring us to our next point, which is that in Stranger Things, yes, there's a whole heap of nostalgia, and yes, they know how to push every single one of those buttons. But that at least for myself, I think they're doing something which is a little bit more interesting and more creative than that. And they're using a particular era to evoke a particular set of values and even atmosphere that make telling that kind of story possible. Because to me, at least in a particular genre, there are also always exceptions to this. You know, you've always got like music subcultures like punk going on, or you don't just have one set of perspective or one set of attitudes at a given time. But it is true to say that there is a sort of core center to a lot of pop culture from the 80s, which has this, like you said, this sort of exuberance and this bigness and earnestness to this. And I think
even the hair is big.
The hair, the shoulder pads, everything's big.
Yeah, the colors.
And I think that, to me, that allows you to tell a particular type of story. It's kind of interesting that in talking about Stranger Things, I find that I can't stop talking about pop music in the same breath. But, Robyn and I are also huge fans of a band called Bleachers, which really reinvigorates a kind of 80s musical style, and it's definitely not just aping the past. The frontman for Jack Antonoff does a really good job of not just recreating sort of a bygone era of music, but actually making something new. And again, he's doing the same thing, which is trying to use an era that had a particular perspective to get across a particular set of ideas. And because I have a quote from Jack Antonoff here that says that in describing the music of Bleachers, and its sort of 80s styling, he said, "To me, the 80s were epic and sincere. Music was large and grand and unapologetic." And I spent hours looking for an interview that I'm sure I saw, but I can't verify this. But I remember listening to an interview with him where he said that to him the 80s were a time when the sad or the meaningful or the important songs were also the songs that had a big sound. And I think now we really associate sincerity with like stripped back. You'll often find an artist releases of like their single, and then they release a version of it that is just them on piano or just them on guitar. And, there's no problem with that. I like that just as much as anyone. But you'll see a lot of comments underneath it being like, oh, this sounds more real to me. This sounds more raw.
The real version.
Yeah. And this is the more sincere version,
Yeah.
We really associate that feeling of like stripping it back as sincere. And I think what is trying to happen in Bleachers is that sense of like, well, actually, no, we can have a big epic thing, and it can even be fun and pop and make you want to dance, and also have a deep emotional sense to it, or even a deep virtue to it. And it can be
true,
Mm-hmm.
There can be a truth present in that,
Yeah. And to me, it kind of speaks to the fact that Stranger Things almost works like a fairy tale. It's got a real sense of like happy endings and cliches, and even that sense of like it's very referential with its pop culture. Like, there'll be a Ghostbusters reference or even a Lord of the Rings reference, or there's a lot of things that modern audiences will be like, oh, I know what that is, but to me, it almost works like fairy tale tropes. Like if a old woman shows up in a fairy tale, or if a frog talks to you in a fairy tale, like there's kind of a set of expectations in those narratives, or references or motifs that you can kind of pick out over and over again. And so within this space, I think that sort of that particular viewpoint of the 80s allows you to tell these stories which are cliched in a good way, because they're speaking to a sort of optimistic or hopeful vision of the world. And Stranger Things is very secular. Like, I don't think there's a single church in Hawkins. I don't know any reference to religion at all in it. And yet there's still a redemptive story within it of self-sacrifice and of virtue. And it reminds me a lot of that Tolkien quote of the eucatastrophe, that like, and joy being at the center of it. I have it here. I know I've quoted it before, but I'll quote it again. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things that which fairy tales can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of a discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. the possibility of these things is necessary to the joy of deliverance, it denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. And I think that's really interesting to me, because I think, again, it's always good to give the other point and say that there's also an important place for stories which are very broken and do explore the brokenness of humanity in a more cynical or dark or troubled way. But that I think Stranger Things does a really good job of presenting evil, first of all, in a very straightforward good versus evil way. Also evil in the sense of like we kind of said, governmental evil, family breakdown evil, as triggers for genuine bad things in the world. They're not just meaningless background. They do contribute, but ultimately that they feed into this world, which is a fairy tale, in that like Tolkien said, that it has this joy, and that its 80s setting allows you to explore that with the expectation of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I will say that there is real sadness in seeing some of the brokenness in the families, and you know, we are in a way still waiting for like a really like straight good father figure. I think I think Joyce has to be one of the kind of like iconically amazing mothers in like media now, but there are ways in which kind of there is the disappointment of reality present. But yeah, like you said, that there, I guess in a lot of the kind of TV that we see now, particularly maybe not so much in cinema with kind of the superhero genre, which is very optimistic and hopeful, but a lot of the kind of TV that we see now is just, it's very dark to the point of kind of like despair. It's not just showing it a reality, but it's actually kind of speaking to a reality where there is no hope at the end of the day. And so it is refreshing to see something that's kind of so present in pop culture that does have a, whilst difficult, ultimately kind of hopeful vision of humanity and of the kind of goodness of people to kind of overcome their mistakes and grow and move forward.
Yeah, and to just earnestly like things. I think it really draws a very kind of earnest enjoyment out of you. I have a quote here which is from an article which is about a professor explaining why we like Stranger Things, and he was meditating on this line that was actually from an Umberto Eco essay which says, 2 cliches make us laugh, 100 cliches moves us. And he says, if you just use one, then it feels contrived, but if you do all of them together, it becomes a masterpiece of referentiality. These are tried and true techniques that resonate with people, and if you find a way to weave them all together and do a cohesive plotline, then it just wins you over. And that's exactly what it did to me, because there were so many of them that the Duffer Brothers used. I just let my defenses down and I just really enjoyed it, you know? And I think it's a nice thing to see that we can still produce stories that understand this kind of, interestingly, this heritage of storytelling that we've had from all time, and bring it into a more modern context, but using, I don't think that story would work in a more modern setting, or even in a less, in an era that was more cynical or more afraid. That there's a sense of the fearlessness or the optimism of the era that allows that story to work.
And I guess the freedom of a world that's kind of devoid of screens as well, to a large extent, you know? Like you said before, that mystery, in order to have mystery, you kind of have to not have digital devices to a certain extent. And certainly in this world, you do, the fact that you can't just call somebody, or the kids don't have phones, and so when somebody goes on a bike ride and they don't, they go missing, and there's no easy way to track them. There's not the same kind of CCTV devices in place. There's just not the same sort of digital trail following people. And also people are not connected to the digital devices themselves in such a way as that they go out and they explore the world, and when strange things happen, the kids want to go out into the woods and kind of figure it out for themselves, which I guess is maybe less believable, sadly, in our kind of the year that we live in now, where there isn't the same sort of joy of exploring the world in children as there was maybe in that era, with the kind of freedom. And obviously the counterbalance to that is that things do go wrong, and you know, in the 80s there was a big crisis of and fear around children going missing. And so yeah, there is a safety, but also I guess a loss of freedom that comes with our social interactions being so digitized.
Yeah, I've got a quote from the Duffer Brothers, who are the creators of the show, like we said, but they said, "For us, we like going back to a time, and I'm sure nostalgia is feeding into that." We've got all of our keywords here. "And I'm sure nostalgia is feeding into that, where cell phones and the internet weren't around. If you went off with your friends, it felt like you really could get lost on a grand adventure." And I think you're right. There were some excellent articles about this which talk about how I think the Duffer Brothers do a good job of highlighting that this sort of latchkey parenting wasn't the pinnacle of parenting at the same time, and yet that there's something that we now miss with helicopter parenting, of like the constrainedness, or the moving on to the digital realm, which presents its own scary elements to it. I know we were listening to an old Fountains of Carrots podcast episode where they were talking about maybe the upside down being a sort of vision of the internet, of this like thing that can suck you in and hollow you out.
Its own sort of traumatic alternate version of the world, you know, where everything's a little bit distorted and strange and not the way that it is when we're actually face to face. I have an article here which is called "The Strangeness of Stranger Things," which says, "The Stranger Things leans heavily on its 80s milieu, the kids on bicycles, the painstaking attention to the period set design, the dated hairstyles, and the 10-hour Dungeons and Dragons sessions are all there. The show slyly cultivates a sense of loss about those things. We have traded the imaginative social experience of D&D for passive screen time in which the game does the imagining for you. We are also drawn to the unencumbered freedom the children have tearing around the town of Hawkins, and to the preteen friendly space the boys set up in the basement of the Wheeler's house. There they can exercise a limited sovereignty appropriate to children on the cusp of adolescence without constant adult intervention and supervision. Still, the sense of loss is not without a healthy critique. We quickly recognize that the children's freedom is a product of parental neglect, born either of incompetence in the Wheeler's case or from distraction in the case of the divorced and abandoned Joyce Byers." So I think it is good to remember that. But I think what's interesting is that when they do encounter evil, even within that, and not that I would say that it's a good thing for children to encounter a literal monster in the woods, but that I think as viewers it speaks to a yearning within ourselves to feel like there's a tangible battle to be won, or a real encounter. And even if it's a case that we're encountering something evil or bad, but a reminder that the supernatural is real, and that it is something that we can encounter. And, you know, in the case of Stranger Things, it's a negative thing, it's an evil thing, but that from a Catholic point of view, we can know that it is both. It is both. There is the flip side, there is the evil, there is the demonic, but that, you know, that sense that real life can still happen to you. And that, like you said, that there's this kind of paradox where in order to encounter mystery and the intangible and the numinous and the things that are beyond our kind of tactile world, that we actually need tactile things in order to do that. Like for Catholics, we would say about the sort of the bells and smells, as we say, or, you know, the reality of the transubstantiation, or the reality of the incarnation, that all of these things come to us through things that are real. And so this move that we've had, that I think really
answers the question of why we are struggling with nostalgia at the moment is this kind of massive shift to the digital space that we just don't know how to deal with yet. And that it's not surprising that like we could have existed as human creatures for so many thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and then within the last 30 years the internet arrived and changed so much of how we interact with the world.
Yeah, and I think we see even in season 3 that the mall, to a certain extent, is seen as like a parallel to that of the sort of like the everything now mentality, of sort of a place to be, in which kind of like you can create yourself as a kind of perfected vision of yourself, and yeah.
And that it also feeds into our nostalgia. I know in the last episode of the podcast, I recommended Bo Burnham's comedy special Inside, which, again, Bo Burnham is a comedian who talks a lot about how by the fact that we sort of perform our lives online, we're sort of performing them in order to be nostalgic at looking back at them. That like the reason to experience something is so that not only can other people look at it, but you can look back at it and say, oh, I did that then, you know, rather than to actually experience it at the time.
That even your own reality is sort of being seen through the framework of an unreality that you are anticipating that is greater than what is right in front of you, which is, I don't know, just very toxic and a sad way to view the world, really.
Yeah. But I think you're really right to say that the mall or the shopping mall as the sort of internet equivalent is actually quite interesting and yeah, maybe I hadn't really thought about it that way, but that idea of a space where you come to meet people and you've got advertisement and commercialism thrown in your face at all times.
Yeah, that it's like that's the medium through which you're interacting is through kind of, I guess, consumerism to a large extent, and people trying to sell you things, you know, but you're really there to hang out.
Yeah.
But the only way to hang out is to be in this space where it's just everybody wants to like you to buy things.
And again, I'm going to have one last pop music reference, which is any of the listeners who, like me, are fans of Taylor Swift will be kind of screaming a lyric from her most recent album in your head, which is, she has a line which is like, we were like the mole before the internet, it was the one place to be. And I grew up in a relatively small Irish, I'm putting city in inverted commas, it was a town, and so there was a mall and I did hang out at it, but I don't think I have any of the like huge swelling nostalgia about the mall.
I remember when I was 12 going to the mall and that being a thing and getting your smoothie and with your €5 that you've been given, and how this was like a real sense of freedom, but then it loses its charm very quickly, and that it's the same experience. You know, very quickly you realize that there's really nothing deeper to be kind of interacted with than the surface stuff that's available.
I think it runs into that kind of constant battle between the commercialization and the realization that the commercialization is a bad thing. So I think you pointed out to me that they collaborated with 75 different brands in order to promote that season of the show.
Yeah, and to the extent where they kind of like convinced Coke to bring out new Coke again, which was like a flop at the time, so I'm not sure how. So
wasn't it like a new recipe for Coca-Cola?
Yeah, it was a version of new, like, so I think in the 80s they brought out a thing called New Coke, which was like a new recipe that was meant to be even better, but then no one liked it. And so they brought out New Coke again. And then there's like things like there's a lot of product placement in the show, and a lot of those products, you know, soar during the time that the show is out and then kind of dip again, like Kellogg's Eggos, which I think are a kind of a waffle that Eleven loves.
Oh yeah, like I've only really spent one occasion in the United States, and I was thrilled that the place that I was staying, the Airbnb, had Eggo waffles, and I was like, I get to try Eggo waffles. And The idea that that would be like a highlight of my trip to America, where I was in a sort of beautiful landscape in upstate New York for a wedding, that like that would be the thing that I'm focused on, that I get to try this American corporate brand of waffles because I saw it on a TV show. They were tasty, I will say.
Oh, I'm glad, because they kind of do make out in the show that they're not that great. It's sort of like Eleven's really into them, and they're kind of like, but there is other food also.
Yeah. While the third season really centers on the mall, the other part of it is that there's a lot of protests about the mall because it totally hollows out the town.
It's destroyed the downtown, and kind of Joyce's shop is totally empty, and like that's a kind of an underlying plot point that's going on amidst all of the supernatural chaos. We can see that, like an analogous version of that almost in Netflix streaming, and you know, Amazon's kind of hold on the market for like selling products and stuff like that, in terms of kind of just usurping all of the focus.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting place for creative people at the moment, in that you sort of have to compromise on the fact that the medium in which you're telling your story through is the thing that you're critiquing at the same time. I think it's the same. Yes. It's the same for Bo Burnham's comedy special, which is raising the alert about the problems of living your life online, and yet you're streaming it on Netflix, and he openly admits that you're streaming it on Netflix. And the same with Stranger Things, that like that sense of lack of community, of like of having a central reference point for TV, and like no, you have to sign up for this company and abide by what this company does in order to access this, you know. And I think that's really interesting, of that balance of the different ways in which modernity is impacting us. And I think the different ways that Stranger Things actually encounters evil is kind of telling in that way, that it isn't just one form of evil, it's not just one set of things. And I think, again, that also goes back to tying into the sort of fairy tale aspect. And there was a really excellent article by Alexi Sargent where he talks about this, and he says, the monsters of Stranger Things remain mysterious enough that we don't know what motivates them. Animal hunger and instinct, or some rational but alien agenda we cannot grasp. But allegorically, the monsters have a clear role. They're orphan eaters. Every supernatural evil on the show has its root in the abuse and abandonment of children. That trauma, no, sin, festers and spreads to imperil everything wholesome. The ethics of the show are clearest on this point. Other patterns appear in its moral universe. Lies, however well-intentioned, always sow chaos. Generosity, however foolhardy, always has its reward. But the deepest theme is that parental wrongs are never without ramifications. A recurring image in both seasons is that of the child characters speeding around on their bicycles, gliding on the dark wooded roads lit only by their bike headlights. This free-range childhood is both a throwback idyll and the source of danger and tension. We know that what might be lurking in those woods, but it's not constant supervision that the children need. Helicopter parenting won't save Hawkins. Hopper tries something like that with 11 and it proves stifling. What the children need are adults who see them as individuals learning to navigate a morally fraught world and provide them with care, attention and good examples. Adults who build homes that are sanctuaries from darkness and places where children can equip themselves to go out and confront the monsters. I think that's what's so satisfying about watching it, is that sense of them against the world, you know?
Yeah.
And it's them against the world in all kinds of ways, whether it's the sort of bureaucratic slowness or the corporate greed or the nefariousness of government ambitions or an evil that you cannot understand or grasp that comes at you directly from another world, you know, that within it, that core kind of set of virtues is at the heart of it. And it goes to that Chesterton quote that everyone mangles and abbreviates, but that fairy tales don't tell you that dragons exist, they tell you that they can be defeated. Well, I think that in a roundabout way covers the theme of, I guess, nostalgia, fairy tales, digital existence. I don't know.
I guess it's a testament to the show that there's just a lot in it, and there's a lot of ways you can kind of look at it. It's very rich in kind of like thematic resonance to our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I know the season 4 is coming out next year, but I'm pleased to be doing it at this time of year, because to me, like I said, I think it's a fun time of the year to watch it. I forced Phoebe to watch it, and she did enjoy it, but it's so funny because she found the kind of gruesome horror elements of it really difficult and kind of pushing her, whereas for me, I almost don't even like register that there's like kind of gruesome like monster stuff in it. I'm just like, yeah, but the characters are so fun.
It's quite visceral in places, and that must be said for anyone who hasn't seen Stranger Things. I feel like most people have at this point. Yeah, if you're not into kind of like visceral, like not so much gory, but just like monstery, bogey-ish horror.
Yeah, the monsters themselves, I think it's less about people being injured that's an issue in it. It's more that the monsters themselves...
Steve Harrington inevitably by the end has a smashed up face once per season.
Once per season, Steve Harrington gets his nose broken or whatever.
His face is not happy by the end of each season.
But for the most part, I think, the gore comes from the design of the monsters themselves. Yes. They're quite sort of like, I guess, pulsating and gross, but I would really recommend it. And if anyone listening enjoys Stranger Things, reach out and let me know. And I'll also say this as a roundup, I like all 3 seasons. I do think the second one is maybe the weakest. I think it's
it's slower paced
and less optimistic as well, more troubled, and then the third one kind of maybe overcorrects into a sort of exuberance and referentiality. But to me, I would rather see it go in the direction of that sort of exuberance than into the more cynical version. So, but I like all 3 seasons. I think they're all great. And
yeah, me too.
I have my fingers crossed that season 4 will also be great. Please God. And thanks so much for joining me on this, Robyn. I knew I wanted to talk to you. There's a character in season 3 called Robyn, and Robyn even shares the kind of same hair tone as her. So I guess it was Halloween 2 years ago that you dressed up as her.
Yeah. Yep, I did. I went to great efforts to make my Scoops Ahoy costume, which was very fun.
So
everything, like, I just love the world that this show inhabits so much that I want to wear it.
Now that I've got slightly longer hair, we could maybe do a double costume of Elle and Max from season 3.
Oh my gosh, yes.
So
that was so fun.
And I think the characters on that show are so fun and heartwarming, and there's always at least one in every season that like of a kind of grouping or a pairing or a matchup of people who get thrown into a situation together that you're just like, every time it cuts back to them, you're like, yes, I can't wait to see what's happening now.
And that, I guess for me, that's like what I love 80s cinema, and it's for that thing of just the joy of watching it. Is just like it's sometimes you know what's coming, but it's like you're just reveling in the way that they do it, and I just think that Stranger Things nails that atmosphere, and that's why it's just so fun.
Absolutely. And so I guess now that we've told everyone how much we enjoy Stranger Things, I get to ask you, what else are you enjoying at the moment?
So I was thinking on this. I think I'm going to say, actually, and it's thematically a little different. It's maybe not as kind of like quite as 80s as some of his other pieces, but I was going to say actually Jack Antonoff's most recent album, Take This On, A Set of Saturday Night, which actually deals with some very interesting kind of themes. Like he doesn't personally believe in God, but he's dealing a lot with the ideas of having a draw, as he says, what do I do with all this faith? He has a real draw to something greater than himself, and he's kind of reckoning with that in the album. And so great bangers, but also lyrically really rich as well. So
I love all of the Bleachers albums. It's 3 now, so 3 seasons of Stranger Things and 3 Bleachers albums, and I love all of them. I mean, I could say that as well. I think what I'll say is I'll actually say another movie, which I think will maybe just offer a little bit of a counterpoint, which is that Phoebe and I watched An American in Paris, which I had seen large set pieces of before. I'd been to a concert, a live performance of Gene Kelly So they would screen the moments from the film, but they would perform the music live. And so I'd seen large sections of it, but I hadn't actually seen it the whole way through. And it just reminded me, it's not my favorite musical, but it just reminds me, I was saying this to a friend recently, that like I almost feel like, especially those 1950s musicals, but that golden era of Hollywood in general, it almost feels like a different art form to film now. And I like film now. I'm not saying that again as just disparaging, like everything new is bad and everything old is good, but it's so different. And again, it's very uplifting. And An American in Paris ends with a 25-minute essentially ballet performance at the end, in which there is no dialogue, and the dialogue never comes back in to end the film. There's essentially a long dream sequence, and then there's about a 2-minute scene at the end that wraps up the film, but there's no talking in it. And the idea that you would even suggest something like that like
this wouldn't happen.
It would just never happen. And it's just like a big artistic exercise. It's a dream sequence. It's got like a lot of art into it, because the main character that Gene Kelly is playing is an artist, and so it's his imagining of Paris that they're dancing around. And like I said, I really enjoy watching those older movies. I find it kind of frustrating that it's actually a little difficult to access those movies. Those don't tend to be on streaming services, and they don't, like, if they're on TV they're at like 3 p.m. in the afternoon or something, if they're on at all. And I think it's kind of a shame. I think we could all benefit from having more familiarity with that era of filmmaking.
Absolutely. It's its own whole different language, really, of kind of like cinema that I think teaches us things about kind of like the human condition in just like different ways. Well worth watching a good old classic.
I'm a huge Gene Kelly fan, so that was another reason to watch it. Okay, well, I think that's it. I hope everyone is enjoying their autumn, and I am really grateful. We've got some new listeners since we've come back after summer, and I'm super grateful for everyone who listens to the podcast, and continue to share it, please. That really helps us kind of reach more people. But I'm just really grateful for all of the listeners, and thanks so much for being here and checking in with our conversations, whether they're on Dante or whether they're on Stranger Things. And as always, you can sign up to our newsletter, which is there's a form on my website. If you go to rachelsherlock.com/podcast, you can find it there. And we're on Instagram, Risking Enchantment Podcast, and I'm on Twitter at Seeking Watson. And is there anything you'd like to shout out, Robyn?
I do I think just Robyn Conroy Art is my Instagram, if you want to check that out. I'm not very active on it, but it's there.
And Robyn is doing amazing work with the Levin magazine. She's contributing a lot of design elements to it, and it's such a beautiful looking magazine. It's currently digital. I think we got fingers crossed that maybe that will change in the future, that we might be able to get our hands on it, which is a great thing, because not only are the articles in it really, really great, but the design, and I think design is so important to luring people into reading something. So, Robyn does great work for that. So that's Levin magazine, which you can also find on Instagram and on Twitter. And I think that's it. And until next time, thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.
This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.